Hello, I'm Taylor.
I'm Ryan.
And this is Unbetween. So this conversation is called Shepherds and Stages because we're talking about leaders and followers, because you can't have one without the other. And this was supposed to be one episode, but we just couldn't stop talking. And so it turned into two, and we cut it down as much as we could, but in reality, we had a lot to say and a lot to think about and a lot, as you'll hear, to kind of work through on mic. It was one of those things where when we sat down, we didn't expect it to go all the places it went, but there was just a lot there. When we first start the episode, I do refer to a conversation I had with somebody off mic, but it was pertinent to what we wanted to talk about, and so we left it in. It gets real general real quick. So buckle in. The ride will be worth it, I promise. Here we go. Yeah, he said it was it's about the Residents of Earth episode, and he said it was a good continuation to the Citizens of Heaven. And one of his remarks was that there's a lot more I feel like y'all could talk about there. And I said, well, yeah, that was kind of the point, honestly, for the Citizens of Heaven episode, was to kind of have a launching point.
Man, that's the interesting thing, because if we wanted to, we could probably connect every episode to that kind of key thought process of being a citizen of heaven. Because if you've got that mindset, most things are going to fall into place. And really, to have that mindset, it's follow Jesus, not all this other crap.
Yes.
You know, and that's said very simply and dumbly, but yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the key thing there. If you're doing those things and living toward that, for that, it's funny how many things don't matter here on earth.
Yeah. Well, and I've had the thought before, and I don't know if this is original to me or not, but religion is man complicating what God made simple.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah. And a lot of it's because we want to make sense of it, and there's some things you just can't make sense of. You know, yeah. I think one of the, and I don't know where I heard it or who I was talking to when it was said, but I heard one time there's a certain level of mystery you have to be okay with in order to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
And so when you start trying to understand things that are that mystery, it's going to be tough. Not that you shouldn't seek to understand. I think we should. But I think there's got to be that understanding of, though I'm seeking this and seeking God in it, you know, not just seeking some understanding or subject, but seeking God toward a way of understanding that subject, it may be that I never actually come to terms with what it is or land on it. Doesn't mean you don't seek it. It means we don't get caught up in it in a way that distracts from what following God really is.
Well, for us, a lot of the time, knowledge is control, in that we want to know all we can so that we can exert control over things. Like, to know something is to control it, I guess. And there are some things ultimately that are just beyond our kin, as it were. And as you say, we have to be okay with that. And it doesn't mean that we don't try and understand it or don't pursue it, but we have to leave room for the mystery of God and also for the wisdom of God, because we, as dearly beloved children, as we're often called in the Bible, that as we both have children, and we know, because we have more experience than they do, the times which you don't need to know that right now. That is beyond what you're ready for. That is beyond what I want you to have to think about or mess with. It is not the right time for you to know that thing. And you have to trust me, and you have to be okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a little bit of a struggle there. And, you know, my wife and I deal with this a lot, but there's a certain amount of struggle in trying to make sure I don't come across as legalistic and kind of skirting around, you know, grace in the way I parent. But also, there's a point where it's okay for you where we get to where you understand that. You know, so there's constantly things that's, well, no, you can't do that. Or no, we don't do this. And it's, my urge is to not say those things because I want to explain and I want to help my kids get to the point where their faith is their own and not what just I've told them, because then we get into what, a few episodes back we went through our series.
Yeah.
I think it's easier for those things to happen, but at this age, they're not going to understand that. So do I confuse the mess out of them, or do I say, hey, no, you don't do that right now? That's not what you need to be doing. There's a point where they understand, so I don't tell them that their whole life. I don't want to be 18 saying, hey, don't juggle knives. Like, there's a point before then where they have to start understanding and thinking. But until that part, I think we have to be careful.
I guess the way it looks for us older folks, it is what do we do with hardship and suffering and sacrifice? Kind of what do we do with our headspace when we're in the midst of those things? And, we've talked before, I think it was on our last episode, that at least to a certain degree, I don't think God doesn't cause everything bad that happens, I don't think, but he also sometimes intervenes in ways that from our perspective seem bad or seem hard or harsh or what have you.
Removing his hand from us kind of a thing.
Yeah, but I mean, that happens a lot more often, but even sometimes he acts more directly and we would perceive it as something bad happening. And in those moments, it's that thing of, can we trust that ultimately he's a good father and he knows when to discipline or when to remove access to the good thing that we like and enjoy, or things like, well, why am I going through this right now? It's not because of anything that I did, is it? And a lot of times, like, no, it's just life under the sun, where there's a whole bunch of other humans making crappy choices, and there's your crappy choices, and those kind of accumulate. Then there's just the chaotic randomness, and then there's spiritual evil at work who's actively trying to tear things down. And some of the time it's not like, well, it's not that there's an overarching purpose in this other than I still want you to trust me even if your life is falling apart. And it's the same kind of thing. It's just kind of it's up a few notches up the ladder, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's important. You mentioned seems like your life's falling apart. I think we've gotten to a point where we expect that it shouldn't be. When there's nothing biblical about the concept of our lives going a certain way. In fact, more often than not, you mentioned suffering earlier, more often than not, there is going to be suffering. This is what you're going to go through. So here's what we do. Not, if you happen to fall into some kind of a struggle in life, like, no, that's pretty much guaranteed. We just don't like it, Yeah.
Yes. And who would?
Right. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think we kind of jumped in without really exactly deciding where we're going, but I like it. I think we kind of talked earlier about, I think, where we're going with this episode. And if not, we'll edit and cut and tailor it to go a new direction. But I think a lot of what we say we might talk about is rooted in a not understanding really what the Bible says about certain things, or knowing something, but then in your head, not really believing it or thinking on it. And one of the things we'd mentioned, talking about for this episode was when a leader, when someone that we've put on a pedestal in some ways falls, how we handle that and what happens. And I think, it's kind of all the same thing. You've got someone that we know is a sinner, that we know is there's no good in, again, looking at what Scripture says, but is saved by grace. But we have put them to a certain level. And for a reason, they're there to be beyond reproach and these things, but we've put them on a certain level that's even beyond reproach, right? To where when they do fall, that rocks the foundations of our faith. And so I think that brings a lot of questions. One, I think we're putting people on a level we shouldn't, but two, what's the foundation of our faith if when they fall, which we know is going to happen, it causes our world to crumble?
Yeah. Well, and Preston Sprinkle, who is a theologian that I highly recommend because he handles these kinds of things with a lot of care and grace, amongst a whole bunch of other issues as well. One of the things that he's fond of saying is we need to be concerned with not with what the Bible says, but what it means. And which I think is a good way to frame the question. Like that phrase, even above reproach. What does that mean? When I think of somebody above reproach, I don't think of somebody who is perfect, because there was only one guy who was. What I do think about is somebody who has integrity, godly integrity. And when I think of that person, he or she is not going to be perfect. It's not that they aren't going to make mistakes or even mess up royally. It's how they handle themselves in those moments. How do they take correction? How do they handle repentance? How do they handle restoration? And how do they move past that mistake or that failing? And I think that's a component of above reproach that we have to include. Do they truly humble themselves when they fall? And I think a lot of the time, at least in examples you and I have seen that kind of led to us wanting to talk about this, the answer is no. Like they I think what we're bothered by is when people prove not just to be not above reproach, in the sense that I think generally people think of it was like, well, I guess they weren't who they turned out to be. But also then it's like, well, it's not just that they messed up, but this revealed depths to their character or lack thereof that I didn't know were there. And I didn't know that this turned out to be a different kind of person altogether than I had thought that they were.
I think that's something we have to be a lot more aware of, and where we put relationships. I mean, I use the example pretty frequently of my parents. My parents divorced a number of years ago, and when that happened, it took me kind of to this point of something. It made me view them in a different way, more human. Not that I never, saw them do anything wrong, but it was these are people I know their character, I know who they are, and trust them. And then this has happened, and it kind of rocked my world for a little while, not to the point of unbelief, but definitely to the point of doubting some things I believed. And especially when we say things, in situations like, well, this isn't ever going to happen, or I'm never going to do this, or this isn't an option, divorce isn't an option. And then when it happens, well, now what? What about everything else I don't believe is going to happen? Yeah. And so I remember at that point kind of just looking there and saying, okay, you know what? I'm never going to say that's not an option, because it obviously is. What do I do to make sure it's not one I'm willing to take? Yeah.
There, but for the grace of God go I. And I don't think we actually believe that about ourselves most of the time, or the people that we put on pedestals. I don't think we're allowed to, really. I think we have the expectation already, and then we're trained both kind of by the church or by Christianity, and then also by the way that leaders often conduct themselves, to expect godlike performance out of them. And that anybody who can't perform at that level isn't worthy of the position.
Yeah, and I think even this is maybe a twofold conversation, or maybe we get into it on this one, or it's another episode. But you had mentioned to me even, you sent me a text from, or a tweet from someone I respect highly and follow, and it's been in, some things and kind of something they had said about false teachings, and I guess that maybe seemed harsh, and it's okay, is that the right way to handle it, or how do we do this? And so maybe that's something we get into a little bit too, or maybe that's a part two. But I think that's even part of it as well. I think we have to know how to view people, know how to regard them. And then I think there's this other side of it, that is when they mess up, how do we handle it? Because I think there's people who have moral failures, and there's people who maybe theologically have some issues with their thinking that's sending people down a wrong path. And I don't think that's something we ignore. But how do you treat that? Is it, do we fall into that cancel culture where we say, oh, everything they say is out, which maybe it needs to be, but what's the best way to handle that? Because you don't want to send people toward that kind of teaching if it's false. But
yeah, I think the thing is, I can think of examples of people in churches I was in, or just that I've known, who I would say maybe fell off the leadership cart in one way or another, or maybe didn't handle themselves well, or what have you. And I can look back at that and say, okay, that wasn't good, what this person was doing, or that decision they made, or that mistake that they made, or that failing that they had that was a result of their own bad choices. I can acknowledge that, but I don't think that invalidates everything good that came out of what they were doing either. Because despite all that, I think I can still see God at work in those things. And there are things that those folks did that even if they weren't where they were supposed to be, even if they weren't handling themselves how they were supposed to handle themselves, God was still at work anyway. And that's true of all of us at all times. And I think if we have to throw out everything that those people did or said on the basis of their failings, then we're all in big trouble because we're in the same boat. And we all have to be measured by that same yardstick.
Yeah. And we know that there's going to be stuff like that. Again, we read through the Bible about that. And you look at people who are key in the message of Christ and the gospel moving, and key parts of the message who did some horrible things, like some very horrible things. That they would have trouble running for office if they were doing that in this day and time, but God still used them in huge ways. And so we see that, and to the point of even false prophets, we see that. And what's the scripture tell us? It says to beware. Yeah. It says to beware and to disciple in a way where people are going to see that. And so we have warnings, and those warnings are given so we will heed that and beware when it happens and be on watch, not so we can rid the world of it, because we're not going to. Mm-hmm. As long as there's profit to be made, there's going to be people to try and gain from it.
Gosh, there's so many different ways we could go with this.
Yeah, so there's these two facets even of that. I think, to me, I think it's worth starting with how we hold people to be on a pedestal. I think we see a lot of that even in recent news. We saw the Hillsong Carl Lentz, and I don't know the whole deal there. I don't know if more articles have come out about what happened, but all we saw is, I guess, that he was asked to resign or was fired for moral failure. And that's the term I see all the time, is moral failure, which is fine. I don't think we have to know all the details of when people mess up. I'm glad not all my details are out there. But then you start seeing all these things happen and come out, and I can't believe this. And then you've got others, well, I can, he was doing this and hanging out with these people. And I think that's interesting. I think, to your point, there's still good you can probably point to that came out from it. He seemed to have an in with some people that probably your normal pastor isn't going to be able to just go hang out with. Now, is that part of what probably put him into a position to where he struggled with some stuff? Maybe so. I think kind of maybe any of us would in certain positions. But then, another one that you and I have talked about, or I've mentioned in the past, is John Crist, who is a comedian, was really big. And then I don't really even know what all went down there, but I know he stepped away. And then I guess 5-6 months ago, maybe came out with this video basically saying he was getting help, appreciated people hanging with him. He messed up, kind of just laying it out there, and is now back after a hiatus. And so I think there's a number of examples that we see a lot in the music industry. There's quite a few that we've seen, and not always even moral failures, but people just, do something and their fans, believing fans, write them off because of whatever it was.
What we're talking about here is platform, because that is the variable that makes this more complicated, I think. Because if the people we're talking about are just business owners or accountants or, I don't think we think of it in the same way. But because they stand on a stage, because they have followers, because they have clout or social influence, that's the dimension I think really we're talking about, is whether or not they deserve to lose it and whether or not they should have had it in the first place.
That's a big thing. And I think it's easy to say whether they should have had it in the first place from the standpoint of if they were the right person to have it. I think one thing worth getting into is no matter who it is, they should not be the ones with that kind of influence over our lives. Shepherds, guiders, is that a word? Guidance. These things, sure, but they should never be the primary thing driving how close we are to God.
Yeah. I think it's tricky. So I communicate for a living. And even the things that I don't get paid for, I'm still communicating. That is what I am best at if I'm good at anything, is effectively communicating things. Hopefully. My wife may disagree with that, depending on the day.
Depends what it is, huh?
Yeah. And I'm pretty good with people in that I'm comfortable around people generally. I can be myself and kind of navigate most situations. And it's important to me to set people at ease if I'm around them, not in a people-pleasing kind of way, hopefully, but just, I want folks to be able to be themselves, and I kind of know how I need to act to make that happen. Now, there's a trap in that, in that being able to work any room that you walk into, that can go to your head if you're not careful, and you can begin to enjoy the fact that you can garner attention from different kinds of people.
What you just said made me think, and don't let me make you lose your train of thought, but being able to go in and work a room looks a certain way.
Yeah.
Right. And most of my career I've been in sales. And so there's kind of this aspect of you get to know a person real quick. You see how they communicate, how you can reach them, how you can kind of maintain some kind of a common ground. That's easy to do in small groups, in small settings. When you get in front of a big group and try and do that, there's going to be a lot of people who don't like you and think poorly of you and have different views about what you're doing even.
Well, kind of where I was going with that, and it ties into what you're saying, is that is we're talking about charisma, the ability to effectively communicate, to compel people to get their attention, to get them to do stuff. All those things kind of bundled together. And the problem is we have people responding to the method, charismatic person on a stage, rather than the message, which is the content, the truth of the scriptures, the wisdom of lived experience, the exhortation of other believers, which are all the things that leadership is supposed to do, the guiding, the shepherding. We're more addicted to the charisma than we are to the content or to the kind of the bedrock of what's there. And so it's not that we don't care what they say at all, or that there aren't examples of people who are doing a good job of balancing those things, but the problem is charisma only gets you as far as you have fuel in that particular tank. And when you begin to dilute charisma, when a person is driving something on the force of their own personality and their own energies, there is a finite limit on that, and they will burn all the fuel in their tank eventually. And if that's what the whole thing is riding on, then anybody who's on that train is going to be in trouble when that fuel runs out, or when the engineer decides to jump ship.
Man, there's so many points there. That's also an issue. You've got someone, you made the comment, trying to convince you, persuade you, and that becomes an issue, because there's also a lot of people in positions out there who are doing things a certain way to connect with people. Mm-hmm. And I get reaching an audience, but there's a difference in reaching an audience and then a pastor is supposed to be trying to connect its flock more to Jesus, not to themselves, is probably the best way to say that. And I think I see a lot of times some of your more celebrity type, not that it's just them, but are very focused on looking and appearing and connecting in a certain way. And I think a lot of times that desire to do that ends up taking away from how they're reaching people to Christ.
The question then becomes, how are we measuring success? Because the thing that you just described, the way you measure the success is how many people are in the pews, or how much money is in the bank, or at what percentage rate are we growing, or how many buildings do we have? Those are the only ways that thing knows how to measure success. Because kingdom success, those words don't even really quite go together, but God's kingdom advancing
there you go,
cannot be measured in those ways, really.
Yeah.
It takes somebody invested in somebody else's life who knows how to discern through the mind of Christ whether or not the fruit of the Spirit is there. By these things you will know them, kind of thing. And how do you put that on a spreadsheet? How do you quantify that with a number of followers on a social media platform? How do you sum that up in a SWOT analysis or in, you know what I mean? It is two fundamentally different things that you're after. Yeah. And sometimes the Venn diagram overlaps and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I heard someone the other day who involved in church planting movements across the world, spent time in the Middle East kind of doing that. And he had mentioned, the way you measure successful church planting is that it's growing out across the world, not big as in one place. Mm-hmm. He said, look at a big family, as they grow, a lot of times end up spreading out across a country or an area. And you see it grow in a bigger way than just, these are the Smiths from this area. They've gone all over and there's a wider impact. And that's what a healthy church should do. Not build up in one place really great to be something big in one area. We've seen that, fail in the Bible. It's about spreading. And, I think we're looking at success in wrong ways. And I think if the desire is to grow bigger, to kind of bring it back, to grow bigger and to have more people and to have a wider span as on social media or whatever, some of those things are going to get to your head a little bit.
And we're talking about these things, they seem a little bit broader, but because these are the things that leadership is expected to achieve in church. These are the things that a, quote, successful pastor or successful leader is supposed to produce in the churches or the Christian organizations that they're a part of. And I think, as we mentioned before, I think the majority of people that you find on staff in churches or in, like Christian book organizations or makers of Christian things, I think for the most part, you're going to find good folks there whose heart is in the right place, or at least who are trying honestly to do right by God and doing what they think he wants them to do. And, if that's what he's told them to do, it's none of my business. I can't say what somebody did and didn't hear from God, and I won't try. All I can do is say, well, I don't know if this lines up with Scripture or not, and I'm wondering about what fruit it's producing. That I can do because we're all brothers and sisters here, and in theory, we should be able to do that with each other. But if you part of the platform or the pedestal that people are having handed to them and then perpetuating because they think that's what they're supposed to do, is pursue all these things. And when you don't achieve that, we're done with you. Or when you don't achieve that, you've let me down. Well, you're never going to be able, that's a goalpost that never sits in one place, those things, because you're never going to have a church big enough. You're never going to have a number of conversions to satisfy you. You're never going to have enough followers on those platforms. There's always going to be a younger, hipper, cooler teacher than you, or a bigger, nicer church down the road with a better facility and better qualified staff. Like this, and the kingdom of God is not of this world, and we don't chase that stuff the way that the world does. And when we make those things the focus, and we expect our leaders to deliver them, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, and we're setting them up to burn out at best and to fall all the way off that pedestal we've shoved them up on at worst.
Yeah, by expecting something that they're not supposed to be, or expecting more out of them than we ever should. And and I think as I look at pastors and kind of relationships, one of the best things for them is probably also one of the worst things in some ways. I think a lot of pastors, because of that, and I think a lot of pastors and leaders in student ministry, things like that, feel like they're really not able to probably be as honest as they want to be.
Oh, yeah.
With congregations, because what will happen. Mm-hmm. And so I think you see a lot of them who probably don't develop the types of relationships they need, not the types of relationships they want their congregation to build with people within the church. And then in the events they do become close with someone, it oftentimes burns them, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a power dynamic there in that, I want to be gentle in how I say this. I think so many people have been infected, if I can use that word, with the CEO view of what a pastor should be. And the senior pastor is the CEO of the church, and he, or she in some cases, makes all the decisions, and it's ultimately that person's vision, that person's charisma, that person's personality and desires that determines the where the church is going. Whether you're talking about a well-known celebrity pastor or something that more on the local level, and I've seen it happen in every kind of different strata of different sizes and kinds of churches. I've also seen it not happen, and I've seen some people who are profoundly disinterested in that, and they're just there to try to be faithful and to serve the Lord. But as somebody who once had a staff position at a church, I can tell you that the lure to those things is real. Yeah. And the expectation that you will deliver on those things is real also. And that to say, I think both pastors and people who are in congregations have those expectations of that pastor. And so neither the pastor nor the congregation has an expectation that that pastor will have peers who he or she is not necessarily leading. They're not necessarily under them. They're not necessarily in charge of them, but who operate on the same level, who are, not interested in coddling them or looking to sharpen them or looking to be friends with them and really pour into them. Now, I say that, of course, there are exceptions to that rule. Of course there are. We've seen that too. But we're talking about this general thing that I think ultimately leads to a lot of burnout and a lot of isolation and a lot of falls and mistakes that could have been prevented.
Yeah, healthy and biblical expectations can kind of prevent a whole lot of fallout if we're operating under that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right. And, you kind of have to look and think there's probably a whole lot of situations that could be avoided if pastors or individuals had someone at that level, even trying to help them and hold them accountable and be there for them. It's almost like your pastor needs a pastor, maybe,
Well, yeah, of course. Your pastor is a human and therefore needs a pastor.
Yeah.
That's the way it was designed.
Yeah, and I think, we talk a lot, or we have talked a lot as we went through, as we went through some of the deconstruction and entrench and disengage, we talked a lot about community. And I think that's, it comes back to that. If that community's there, you have someone to help you through those things. But your pastor also needs that community.
Yeah.
He's got to have it, or else he's on this ship trying to guide it. And, you've got all sorts of people dealing with all sorts of things and thinking all sorts of ways. And he's trying to be a voice to all of them. And that's impossible.
Yeah, it is.
It's not going to happen. And every week, a pastor says something that makes someone in a congregation angry. Mm-hmm. And if he doesn't, I would question if he's maybe preaching how he should be. Yeah. I think we should hear things that convicts us to the point that we're angry at times. But a pastor is going to say something biblical that can make people angry. They may also say something non-biblical that will make people angry. And
yeah.
And, that's understandable in both cases, but it's what do we do with that? And I think if a pastor does not have someone or does not have a relationship where you can go talk to them, if you're writing anonymous letters to your pastor, you're not really helping them, and there's not really a relationship there.
I think an aspect of this that we haven't put into words this way is that I think whether or not we realize it, that a lot of us in churches view ourselves as consumers. We pay money, through tithes, offerings, whatever, to the church for them to Christianize us. And so it is that pastor's job to do Christian stuff to me. I have an expectation. We have an economic contract there.
Yeah.
And so like that's a wall already. you're already not acting in good faith if you set the relationship up that way. And I've heard a lot of people put it into words, probably not even realizing that that's what they're saying. It's that thing that happens when, and I've heard people put this into words, well, we're paying him to do such and such, or that's why we hired that pastor, so that he would do da 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 da. Why aren't we seeing growth? Why aren't there more kids? Why isn't the music better? Whatever. It's, well, didn't we hire you to make that stuff happen? And already that's a problem. You're really going to have a hard time getting past that. Because ultimately, a pastor's job is to shepherd people. It's not even, I want to throw this out here, okay? It's not even necessarily to preach or teach. Because those are distinct in the scriptures. When they mention lists of things that people in churches do, they're not exactly the same thing. And when we expect the pastor to be the preacher, the teacher, the counselor, the administrator, and, of course we're setting them up for failure.
That's the other side of it, and the Christian-y things you mentioned that are supposed to be done. I think part of that's a lack of understanding of what it means to even follow Christ.
Yeah.
And again, there's another rabbit trail we can chase, and I could easily go off on a soapbox. I probably shouldn't.
There's so much here, though. There's so much.
There is. I mean, and I feel like at times it's doing an injustice to cut it short to make sure we stay on a one specific point when so many things are interconnected. But I think there's a lot of things that there's a misunderstanding about.
Yeah.
And it's easy to fall into, even as you try to live a life following Christ. But anybody can go to church on Sundays. That does not make you a Christian, does not make you a follower of Christ, does not make you a believer. But I think we've got a lot of believers, Christians, who that's all they do.
I think we have a lot of believers and rather fewer followers.
Yes, that's a great way to point it. A whole lot of Christians, and I think we're kind of exiting the age in the world where it was cool to have the Jesus is my homeboy shirt. So that number's probably shrinking. But, at one point it was cool in pop culture to even have Jesus as your homeboy. But I think we're out of that stage. There's probably fewer than there used to be. But there's a whole lot of Christians, way fewer believers, and then way fewer followers of Christ.
Yeah.
And, as you go through Romans and you're reading that where there is sin, grace abounds more, I think it's easy to say, oh, well, then people are taking advantage of that by just doing whatever they want and sinning, and grace is going to cover that. Well, okay, I get that, but I think there's also a whole lot of people who are believers, but not even following Christ. And
I think it's the thing in James. You believe in God? Good. Demons believe that, but they don't follow. And the way that, again, we keep looping in circles. There's a bunch of Venn diagrams, really, overlapping each other. But we're describing the climate in which leaders in the church have to operate, what their expectations are, and ultimately the ways in which they fall, and trying to kind of make sense of, so what should our response be? So given that, so Carl Lentz, what should we do with him, do you think?
Make him live in a van down by the river. No, I don't. I mean, that's a good question. And I hate to use him when I don't know. It's tough to know without knowing the situation. And then I hate to say that because there's also the matter of, if it's a sin problem, we have a sin problem. But, as much as cancel culture kind of gets under my skin and I don't like it, is there's something that disqualifies someone from being able to be in a leadership position for a while? And I would say yes.
And if I may interrupt, but we're not really talking about a leadership position. We're talking about whether or not he deserves a platform, and those are not the same thing.
Oh, and that's even another conversation, man, because in this day and age, everybody has a platform, and very few of us need it. Man, I feel like I'm about to chase like 80 rabbits. There's that's even right. Like a point where there's given rights as Americans versus given attitudes as a Christian. I think that's the best way I can say that, or as a follower of Christ. As an American, you have a right to say a whole lot of things. So regardless of your sin, there's a chance that in some form or fashion, you have a right to a platform. Now, should you have a platform for Christ under certain situations? Man, I don't know. That's something I could think, about one day and come to one conclusion. Then someone could probably bring something up and I would say, oh, okay. I mean, I think there are certain things without appropriate action and guidance would likely disqualify you from maybe speaking on a matter. I mentioned John Christ earlier, and again, I don't know the whole details, but he came out with a video admitting of some wrong things, saying he went and sought treatment or counseling, saying he was sorry, he repented. I don't have a problem with the guy doing what he was doing, and with what he does, but he made the comment, and what he got paid to do, which was basically show the irony of hypocrisy within Christians, was right there within him too, And so, I don't know, I feel like from what I saw, there was true repentance. I can't be the judge of that necessarily, as much as I may want to. I think there are situations that maybe do take away the right for someone to have a platform for a while. And I say right, I hate to use that word, but maybe they just shouldn't for a while, is probably what I should say.
I think of Mark Driscoll is an interesting example.
That was in my head too. So
because whatever you may think about the guy and his theology and the way he, the way that whole thing went down, it became clear that he didn't seem to think he had anything he needed to work on.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was, and I didn't follow him closely, but there was no pause to reflect. There was no sabbatical. There was no, I'm going to go take a break and think about this. He just bulldozed on from one thing to the next, basically, without drawing a breath.
Yeah.
And I feel like if the thing that you built, that you spent so many years of your life on, what do I know about anything? But that thing which in so many ways carried your name and on the force of you, your person and your charisma and your personality, implodes around you with some pretty serious allegations from people who once called you brother and were standing, arm in arm with you.
And would have done anything for you.
Yeah. That, even if you still don't think you did anything wrong, that should give you pause.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you have been either that you did the things that they're accusing you of, or that you have been so misunderstood by so many people that you need to stop and take stock of how you're putting yourself out there. One of those things needs to happen, seems like to me. And it just, he didn't seem interested in any kind of pause to reflect from what I could tell. And I don't know the guy. I know what he's put out there in public.
Yeah.
But it just seemed like there wasn't any of that. It was, we're going to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that becomes problematic in the fact that if you're trying to convey, share, preach the gospel, and the message is there's none of us are good and we can't be. So thankfully there's God who, is paying the price we all should pay. And that's the only good in us. Don't, bulldoze through, to use your words, when there's something like that. Even if you don't think it's as big a deal as maybe others are making it, use it as an opportunity to share the grace in that, because it almost gives the appearance that you don't feel like you need grace.
Yeah.
Like you don't feel like you're capable of doing wrong. And I think we do allow people to get to levels where, man, they can get there. There's a certain level of power, a certain level of money. I say this a lot. There's a certain level of money I do not need to make.
Yeah.
Because I think you start feeling invincible.
It'll bring out the worst in you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what that number is. I hope I never find out.
Yeah.
But there's a certain number. If I got there, it would not be good. Same thing with power. I think there's a certain level of power that if people attain, it's not good for them. And I'm sorry, but if you've got pastors getting to that level, that's dangerous.
We tend to pick the most obvious examples, but this happens on the small local level all the time. I mean, this can happen with 5 people, It's when you begin to think more of yourself and what you can bring to the table and what your good qualities are than what it is that God is wanting to do through you. And the fact that any good that you have is a result of his goodness passing through you, basically.
Yeah.
And like this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, because it would be very easy for me on the one hand I work in the communication world. So we, marketing and advertising and video and all kinds of communication stuff. I know how to do it. I know how to turn myself into a brand. It would not be good for me to do that. I know keenly, and I'd be good at it. I don't mean that immodestly. It's just that, you do something long enough, you start to get okay at it. That's what we do for other people. The company I work for does. And I'm well aware that I could create and communicate an online persona that would resonate with certain kinds of people, and that there are enough of those people that I could build a following out of it. Mm-hmm. I don't have anything to gain from that.
Yeah. It's making a name for yourself.
Exactly. It's that sounds an awful lot like me increasing and Christ decreasing, which is not what we want.
Or, I mean, in another way, even taking the name of God in vain in some ways, using it for your own profit. And man, maybe we have to have like another season of topics around this, because I think mega churches too is another example, and in a desire to make a name of a church great, and give all the reasons you want so people know what to expect from this group, so people do, whatever. It's much more about making a name of a group great as opposed to making Christ known in a community when you're doing something like that.
And again, I don't think that for the most part, people do this intentionally or with any kind of ill intent. It's what they think they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's what they expect. It's the platform they think they're supposed to aspire to.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Numbers equal souls, as I've heard it put before. So the more numbers we have, the more likely that they're going to hear something that is going to cause them to make a decision, and then they'll join the church, and then they'll get... I don't want to answer all those objections, because I think that is a different conversation. But what I will say is that, again, ultimately, it leads you to shoot for things other than what is kingdom stuff at the bare minimum or the most essential bedrock kind of level.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an easy question to answer. Who am I pointing to?
Yeah.
And if it's not Christ, don't do it. I mean, it should be that simple within these kind of situations.
Well, that's part one. And as you can probably tell, there's just a lot there. There's a lot to say, a lot to think about, a lot to work through, and we're not done yet. We will be back again next week with part two, where we flesh this stuff out a little more and throw some other ideas into the mix as well. Thank you so much for listening. If you would take just a minute and give us a review or a rating on whatever platform you're listening on, it actually helps quite a bit. And if this episode resonates with you and there's somebody in your life that you think would get something good out of it, text it to them, send it to them on Facebook, whatever. Thanks.